going to read from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Last week, of course, Robert talked about the wise men, the Magi who came and worshiped Jesus. This picks up after they've left. Verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said. "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up and he took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I will call my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." So another aspect of faith, and again, this comes from Nicky Gumbel. He does a devotional that I use online. A couple weeks ago, we talked about that aspect of faith, about feeling fear. This week, we're going to look at it a little bit different. Feeling afraid, I should say. I trust him is what we looked at a couple weeks ago. But another aspect of faith, illustrated, I think, by Joseph today, is forsaking all. I take him. Because again, when we look back in Matthew chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "So he got up, and he took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt." So Joseph and Mary had to be taken out of their comfort zone. It's not very likely, except to go to Jerusalem for the appointed festivals like Passover, that Joseph had traveled very much, or that Mary had traveled very much. They lived in Galilee around Nazareth, and that's probably pretty much what their world was. And from Luke's account of the birth of Jesus, we know in chapter 2 of Luke, verse 21, that Mary and Joseph were not wealthy people. We know this because he was taken to the temple, as was required by their law, to be consecrated to the Lord. And if we go back to the rules that Moses gave the people in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 8, it talks about a lamb. But if you can't afford a lamb, then 2 doves or 2 pigeons can be offered for this consecration. Because Exodus chapter 13, verse 2 tells us that every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord. And Exodus 13:12 talks about that you have to redeem the firstborn of your sons. So Joseph, being a righteous man, very zealous for doing what the law required, took his son to Jerusalem on his 8th day of birth to be presented at the temple. And this likely was a very significant event for Joseph and Mary. Because at the temple, again, Luke records a rather unusual thing that took place. As they go into the temple, I'm going to start from Luke chapter 2 with verse 27. It's talking about Simeon. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts, and we saw the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required. Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all the people, a light for your revelation to the Gentiles, and a glory for your people Israel." And the child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. So they knew that there was something very special about Jesus, of course. They knew that also from the visit of the shepherds and the angel at his birth. And then we have this situation, which is probably approximately 2 years after Jesus' birth, where the angel appears to Joseph again, and that's not unusual. that they would stay in Bethlehem, because travel with a young baby would not be easy. And the reason why it's very likely they stayed there is because it talks about when the Magi came, they went to the house where Jesus was. That's not a contradiction. It just means that the shepherds came to the stable, the Magi came later. And we know that they would probably be around when Jesus was 2 years old, because when Herod inquires of the Magi, pretending he wants to go and worship Jesus as well, because first they stop in Jerusalem, the capital city. They go to the king, thinking that's where you would find the king of the Jews. And they talk to Herod, and Herod, of course, doesn't want any competition. So he tells them, well, when you find out where this child is, this Messiah, you come and tell me, because I want to go worship him too. Well, he didn't want to worship him, of course. He wanted to kill him. That was Herod's nature. He had already murdered his wife. He had murdered one of his sons. He had a reputation for killing anyone that he felt might be a threat to him and his throne. And that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to eliminate the prophecy. And the star had appeared approximately 2 years ago. He learned this from the Magi. And so when the Magi went to visit and worship Jesus, they were told not to go back to Herod, so they didn't. And then, as Matthew told us, Herod was furious over this. And so he wanted to do what he could to eliminate that prophecy in Jeremiah. And he didn't lose any time, and that's why I'm thinking it's a very good assumption that Jesus would have been about 2 years old at this time. And ordered his soldiers then to kill all the children that lived in Bethlehem that were 2 years of age and younger, and in that vicinity. And that's when Joseph received this warning from the angel who told him to get up and take the child to Egypt, because Herod is going to try to kill him. And the interesting thing to me is Joseph didn't waste any time. There's a book that I read some time ago. In fact, we used it in Sunday school some time ago. It's written by Claire DeGraff, called The 10-Second Rule. There's a couple interesting quotes I just wanted to share that I think apply to Joseph's attitude. And this is the first thing Claire says, is asking for a big dramatic sign before you move out in simple obedience doesn't really require any faith at all. It's literally walking by sight, not by faith. And then he goes on to explain his 10-second rule. So when you're reasonably sure Jesus is asking you to do something, do it immediately. Waiting just gives you a chance to overthink it, to make it easier to say no to God. Well, Joseph didn't overthink it. When he was told to take the child to Egypt, he didn't wait a few days and say, well, I've never been to Egypt. I might not understand the language there. I do have some means now that the Magi visited. They gave us some gold and some expensive incense and perfume so we can provide for ourselves, but we don't know anybody there. We don't know the language. We can say, I don't want to travel at night. That's dangerous. None of that mattered to Joseph. There's only one thing that mattered. God said, go to Egypt. So Joseph exercised that faith that Nicky Gumbel talks about. Forsaking all, I take him. He wasn't concerned about his comfort zone. He knew that God had this. So that reminded me of an interesting person who lived in Poland during the Nazi era. Her name was Irina Sedler. And she was actually head of what we would call our Department of Human Services for the nation of Poland at the time, the welfare department. But when in 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, brutality and violence and terror became the common method of their control of the community. And then by 1942, the Nazis had ordered anyone that was of Jewish ancestry into a 16-block area, which became known as the Warsaw Ghetto. And no one was to go in and no one was to go out, except for the social worker. Irina Sendler was allowed to go in. And she was appalled by the conditions there. And so she joined the Polish underground resistance, who started a campaign to try to save as many Jewish children as they could. And so what she did, and when she would go in under the guise of her employment of doing things in the ghetto, she would often then smuggle or recruit other people to smuggle out babies. And she would place them with Christian families and give them a new identity to keep them hidden from the Nazis. And she was able to smuggle out 2,500 children during her time. And not only did she do that, she wanted to maintain their heritage. So she buried 2,500 jars by this tree in her neighbor's yard, which was right across the street from the Nazis' headquarters, actually. And in those jars had all the ancestry and information about all these children. And she thought that, someday this war is going to be over. And we're going to be able to get that information to these children, and they'll be able to at least know about their family. Well, of course, she was found out, and she was arrested in 1943. She was tortured by the Gestapo. They broke her feet, her legs, but they couldn't break her spirit, and she never would have revealed where any of these children were. She wouldn't even mention where the jars were. And her story went unknown for a long period of time, but it was actually discovered by some high school students doing a research project, and they brought it to light, and she was given a lot of honors by the nation of Israel for all her work. Because after the war again, she was able to get the jars out and give them to all the kids, so many of their families had been wiped out by the Nazis, but at least they had their heritage and knew where they came from. So forsaking all, I take him. It may not be requiring you to do something like Irena Sendler did. It may require you simply to be willing to not fit in because of your faith. It may simply require you not to worry about being ridiculed as you live your faith. It may simply require you realizing that don't be paralyzed that you can't do everything, but just do what you can by faith. Because that's all part of our worship. As Robert talked about last week, the Magi were not Jewish people, and they were one of the first people to come and worship Jesus. And as I was thinking about that this week, I remembered and looked up, it's another book, Rick Lawrence, Jesus-Centered Life. And he has an interesting thing about worship that I just want to read to you. He says, everybody worships. The only choice is, what do we worship? Some of us worship Jesus. Some of us worship something else. But then in the middle, there's a lot of people that worship Jesus, what he calls plus something else. And he says, and he gives a list here. It could be Jesus plus the American dream, or Jesus plus social media, Jesus plus high achievement, Jesus plus NASCAR or NFL, Jesus plus self-improvement, even Jesus plus Starbucks, or whatever. The list can go on and on. But you get the idea. The overwhelming majority of people are Jesus plus people. Because Jesus only people seem extreme. I mean, they can come off creepy and intense, something other than normal. But the call for faith is to forsake all and to be Jesus only people. Forsaking all, I take him. And if we do that, we can do amazing things. Jim Elliot, for example, and Nate Saint were Jesus only people. They, back in 1955, tried to contact the Akua tribe and share the gospel with them. And some of you may have seen the movie At the End of the Spear. 5 of those missionaries were killed by the Akua tribe in attempting to bring the gospel to them. But the amazing thing is, Nate Saint's sister Rachel and Jim Elliott's wife, eventually, within a couple of years, were living with the Akua tribe. And they actually, through their ministry to the Akua tribe and translating their language into the Bible, the 5 people that were involved in murdering the 5 missionaries became leaders in the church. They were Jesus forsaking all others, taking him, Jesus only people. William Borden, for example, he lived a life of luxury. He was born back in April 9th of 1913. You've heard of Borden Milk. Well, he was part of the Borden family. Lived a very wealthy lifestyle, but he was sent on a trip around the world for his graduation from high school and was touched by God to become a missionary to China. And so the rest of his life he devoted that to be preparing for that mission. He was very bright, could have worked in any secular job making lots of money, but he decided he was going to serve the Lord. So at the age of 25, when he was in Egypt learning Arabic so he could minister to this Muslim people group in China, he contracted cerebral meningitis and died. And depending on which account you read, one source said they found the sheet of paper under his pillow that said no reserves, no retreats, no regrets. Another account that I've read said it was in his Bible that he had written these words at various times. But the point is, that was his motto. No reserves, no regrets, and no retreats. Because he forsaking all, he took him. That was his faith. That was the aspect of his faith. Corrie ten Boom, again, was a person very instrumental in hiding Jews during World War II. And in the book, The Hiding Place, I remember a section of that where it talks about they had arrested them, and her father was elderly. And the Nazi officer was basically telling the father, "Old man, I'm going to let you go home. But you have to promise me you're not going to help these Jews anymore." And his response was, basically, "I serve Christ. If anyone comes to my door needing help, I will help them." Not exactly the answer that the Nazis wanted to hear, so they left him in prison where he died. And again, we may not be called to those dramatic type of things, but we are called to forsake all and to take him. What I want to close with, again, some lyrics from a song. Again, it happens to be the same author, a different song. Lauren Daigle, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's called Trust in You. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I'm wishing I could walk through. When you don't give the answers, as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. Truth is, you know what tomorrow brings. There's not a day ahead you have not seen. So in all things, be my life and breath. I want what you want, Lord, and nothing less. And that was the challenge for Joseph. That's a challenge for me. That's a challenge for you. To live our faith in a way that we forsake all and take him.